Okay, right. I'm going to talk today, that's what I was asked to do, about the connection between social justice and contemporary capitalism. And I'm going to do that starting with a quotation from someone who is, in a sense, at the core of contemporary capitalism, one of the wealthiest men in today's world, and one who is not older than the average participant in this event. Namely, you will have guessed it, Mark Zuckerberg. Here is the quote. I hope you can read it from some distance. I'll go through it slowly, and I'll return to it at various stages in my lecture. Don't start reading it yet. This is part of a speech that Mark Zuckerberg gave last year at the graduation ceremony at Harvard University. Graduation ceremony there is called the commencement, for a bizarre reason. This was a bit of a moving moment for Mark Zuckerberg because he was a student at Harvard, but never finished his studies. He dropped out at the second year because he had other things to do which he found more exciting. This is not an advice to the youngest people among the participants in this event. This is not a recommendation to drop out of school before finishing your degree. But he started off by saying, well, if I finish this speech today, this will be the first time at Harvard that I finish something. And he gave then this speech by mentioning at some point the following. So he says, every generation expands its definition of equality. Equality in red, because I shall return to it. Now it is our time to define a new social contract for our generation. We should have a society that measures progress, not just by the economic metrics of GDP, the gross national product, how growth is usually measured in our societies. But progress should rather be measured, he said, by how many of us have a role we find meaningful, a role in society, a role in the economy which we find meaningful. This should be the criterion for measuring progress and not just growth. We should explore ideas like universal basic income, which is an idea which I was asked explicitly to speak to you about today, to which I'll return at length later in this lecture. Why should we explore ideas like universal basic income? In order to give everyone a cushion to try new things, a cushion to try new things. I'll return to that. We are all going to make mistakes. So we need a society that focuses less on locking us up or stigmatizing us, not locking us up, I return to that, or stigmatizing it. But, and rather, as technology keeps changing, we need to focus more on continuous education throughout our lives. No doubt a theme that is central in this event today. And yes, he say, giving everyone the freedom to pursue purpose. To pursue purpose is, to, in his terms, to find a role that is meaningful to us, that is to find a sense of purpose in our lives, This isn't free, meaning isn't free of charge. It is going to cost. People like me, one of the wealthiest people in the world, should pay for it. And many of you will do well. Many of you, the students at Harvard who are about to get their degree, many of you will do well, and you should do too. That is, you should pay for it too. And no doubt this applies also to many of the young people who take part in this university, in this gathering, this summer school, because they will do well too in their lives. And if this universal basic income is to come about, they will have to contribute to it. And then he goes on in the speech, and at the end of the speech, he mentions, obviously with some emotion, one of his pupils, because occasionally he teaches a class of high school children, secondary school children, and he was struck by one of his best students of Hispanic origin, who was ready to go to university, but he said, I probably can't go to university because I'm here illegally, because he's the child of some undocumented illegal immigrants in the United States. And this obviously outraged Mark Zuckerberg. He thought this is such a talented young man. And then he invited him, so he said last year, I took him out for breakfast on his birthday. I wanted to give him a present, he said, and so I asked what he should give as a present, and then the pupil, started talking about other people, other students who were struggling, who had great difficulties, probably not as talented as him. And finally, he said, you know, if you want to give me a present, you should give me a book about social justice. Social justice. Mark Zuckerberg adds, this was at the end of his talk, I was blown away. I was amazed by the fact that this young man, instead of asking as a present, I don't know, a car, a motorbike, whatever, he asked for a book about social justice. Well, my talk this evening will be about the connection between the various words that I have highlighted by writing them in red. It will be about the connection between social justice, equality, and freedom. And it will be about how all this relates to the proposal now discussed worldwide of a universal, unconditional basic income. Before moving on to that, let me ask the audience a question. So concentrate hard on the question and give yourself a few seconds to answer. And we'll do that by voice. This is a voting method which I learned during my years of teaching at Harvard, which is that I'm going to ask you a question, and I'm not going to ask you to answer that question by raising your hand, but by answering either, in my best Russian, da or niet, okay? And I'm going to count to 3, so if I get it right, 1, 2, 3, and then you are going to answer either da or niet. And the question is about the relationship between equality and social justice. And so the first question I want to ask you is, can inequalities be just? First, the people who think that yes, inequalities will be just, can be just, will answer da when I'll have said 1, 2, 3, okay? 1, 2, 3, okay? Ready? For the people who think the answer is yes? So, can inequality be just? Those who think that they can, are going to say da. 1, 2, 3. Okay? I can hear there is some delay between the people who listen directly in English and the people who wait for the translation. Okay, now the people who say no, inequalities cannot be just, are going to say niet. Okay? 1, 2, 3. Okay. So the audience is divided. I'm here to play professor, so I'm going to give you the right answer now. And to give the right answer, it may be good to go back to perhaps the book that was given by Mark Zuckerberg to his pupil, book about social justice, where the pupil was asking for. And it's a book that really revolutionized political philosophy, the founding book of contemporary political philosophy, which is a book called A Theory of Justice, published in 1971 by a Harvard professor called John Rawls. In fact, John Rawls died in 2002, just in the year that Mark Zuckerberg arrived at Harvard. But this book remains the big classic in the field. And I won't present you the details of that theory, but I'll give you in a nutshell and very briefly, the fundamental answer to the question I just asked, the relationship between justice and equality, that the general answer that is given by a tradition in political philosophy that is commonly called liberal egalitarian, a tradition to which I belong myself. But to motivate that and to indicate, in fact, why the answer to the question is da, that is, there are inequalities that can be just, let me quickly give a couple of examples. First of all, if you have to grade, if you are a teacher and you have to grade your students, obviously justice, a just grading of your students, doesn't consist in giving every student the same grade. Some students are better at the particular subject that you are teaching. Some students made more effort, they studied more, and these obviously will get a higher mark. Similarly, I spent a little bit of last night in a cafe in Vladivostok watching the Belgian national team from my country beat the English national team. Well, a football competition also doesn't consist in giving the same number of points to every team, whatever the number of goals they scored, right? So there are lots of fields of, if what you could call micro environments, like the world of sport, the world of studying, and many others, where justice, a fair treatment of the people, obviously leads to inequality, okay? But you could say this is not really relevant to the question, because the question here is not about these separate fields, so education, sport, whatever, but it's about social justice. And when you think about social justice as a whole, can you allow for inequalities? Can inequalities be just? And the answer there, in my view, and along with Rawls and people in that tradition, which I think is the main tradition in contemporary political philosophy, the answer is yes, for two and only two reasons. Inequalities can be just for two and only two reasons. The first one I motivate with another example, which is this. At the end of this meeting, perhaps the room will be a little bit dirty. Some people will have left some crumbs on the floor or whatever. And if the organizers say then, look, the people, if there is anyone who wants to clean up the room afterwards, they will receive, say, 1,000 rubles for the job. Okay. And so one of you says, I don't know, perhaps you there, sitting there, you say, yes, I'm going to do it for 1,000 rubles. And all the rest of us, we look at him, and we say, okay, fine, he'll do it. And then he does it. And after he does it, we turn to him and we say, justice means equality. So please, let's share these 1,000 rubles between all of us. We'll feel that there is something wrong there, right? And how can we accommodate that in our intuitions about justice? Well, there have been two, historically in the history of political thinking and thinking about justice, there have been two attempts to accommodate that. The first attempt consists in saying, no, justice is not equality. Justice is rather something like proportionality to effort. In this case, everyone should get an income in proportion to his or her efforts, or perhaps more generally as a proportionality to desert, to merit. So there is some sort of notion of merit, how much people merit, and so equality would be unjust if you gave the same to everyone, whatever their merits. That's one way of trying to accommodate that intuition. But of course, you quickly run into difficulties because, well, yes, but it's according to effort, but not everyone has the opportunity to make these efforts. The same sort of work requires more effort from some people than from others. Is it only effort in the productive area or in other areas? And so there are lots of problems related to what the rewards, what income or welfare should be proportional to. So trying to accommodate the intuition in this way by turning from equality to proportionality is tempting at first sight, but leads, in my view, to impossible difficulties impossible to solve. And that's also the view defended by Rawls in one famous part of his book, A Theory of Justice, which is a critique of justice as merit, justice as desert. But there is another way of accommodating that same intuition, accommodating the same idea that it would be unfair for him to distribute his 1,000 rubles equally among all of us. And the second avenue consists in saying, well, no, it's equality that matters, but not equality of outcomes, not equality of incomes, equality of happiness or equality of levels of material welfare. No, what matters is equality in opportunities, in the possibilities that are given to people. And if we are all given the same possibility of cleaning the room, and only one person says, okay, I'll do it, well, given that we all had the same possibility, the result, the inequality that will result with him having 1,000 rubles more than us, this inequality will be just because it will be the result of personal responsibility, of personal choice, of personal preferences. And that's okay. And so the first, and that means that the first ground for legitimate, for just deviation for equality in the resources we have at our disposal, is simply that, personal responsibility. Justice doesn't consist in distributing outcomes in equal ways, in particular incomes, purchasing power, but it consists in distributing opportunities, possibilities, what I shall call also real freedom in an equal or in a fair way. And then what people do with these possibilities that are given to them, it is their responsibility. So I believe in that there is no plausible conception of justice that doesn't make room for personal responsibility, and therefore makes room for inequalities that are just. But this is not the only reason of why inequalities may be justified. And there is a second one, which I like to illustrate with the example of the boss of one of the main, or if not the main, supermarket chain in my country. Every year I've been teaching a big course to 600 students every year called Economic, Social and Political Ethics. And at the end of my teaching, I invite one after the other some personalities with whom I find it interesting for my students to have a dialogue. So I invited the Catholic Archbishop, the Marxist mayor of Molenbeek, which is the part of Brussels where the jihadist terrorists grew up, etc., so a wide variety of people. And then once I invited this big boss of a big supermarket company. And I always have my students preparing questions to be asked to these personalities. And so one of my groups of students asked him the following question. They said, Mr. Colruyt, that is his name, we've seen on the internet that every year you earn 1,600,000 euros. Okay. Your firm has a good reputation in terms of environment, in terms of treating your workers well, but don't you think that 1,600 euros, 1,600,000 euros per year is a bit much? Huh? Isn't it unfair that you should earn so much? What did he answer? He said, 1,600,000? No, that's not correct. But I do earn more than 1 million euros per year. And so over $1,200,000. Don't know how many rubles that is, but quite a lot. And then he said, would I work less? Would I do this job if I were paid half this amount? Of course I would. Of course I would. Because frankly, I'm not really doing this job for the money. I like to to work with all these people, make them work well, perform a useful service. And he doesn't only have good reputation because of the way he treats his personnel, the way he treats the environment, but also because he has this rule that his prices in his supermarket must be the lowest for any particular good than for the same good in any shop within 10 kilometers of where his shops are. So that means that he puts a constant pressure down on all the prices, especially in the poorest areas of the country where the general price level is low. So you could say, well, he does a good job for the community as a whole. So, but he said, so clearly I would do it for quite a bit less money than 1 million euros. But would I do it if I was paid the same as my worst paid employee, the person in my firm working full-time who has the lowest wage? Well, frankly speaking, no, I wouldn't do it. My father, it's a family firm, when he told me, Jeff, this is going to be your job, but you must realize that being the boss of this firm will be a job from the very early morning to late at night, 24 hours and 7 days every week. You'll have that in your mind all the time. So with the stress that is involved, constantly paying attention to all sorts of things, and he said, well, look, I find other things important in my life. He taught that my students. For example, he spends, I think, 2 weeks every year in a monastery, in a Buddhist monastery somewhere in Nepal, I think. And he finds that interesting. He has some artistic taste. So if he were paid as little as the worst paid worker in his firm, then he wouldn't do the job. And this is meant to illustrate something else, which is that it's not only that you can have deviation from equality in order to make room for responsibility. In fact, in order to become the boss of a big supermarket company, you need talents which not everyone has. So you can't say that everyone had the same possibilities of getting into the position of this boss of a big firm. So not everyone has the same possibilities. But inequalities, paying him more, and even quite a bit more, quite a lot more, than some other people, is important, not here for the sake of responsibility, because it's not. What is essential here is the difference in opportunities. But you want to get people with certain talents into certain jobs in which they are good. Similarly, you may want to pay at some point the very good, clever programmers much better than the average citizen, than the average worker or the average member of society. You may want to do that in order to attract these people into jobs in which they are very productive and thereby can benefit the whole of society. And this is then the second reason why inequalities may be just. Because having inequalities, including inequalities in possibilities, not only in outcomes, may be good up to a point for the sake of the efficiency, the economic efficiency of society as a whole. Now, does that mean that we should simply distribute incomes, possibilities to people, income potentials to people in such a way that the output in society is as great as possible? No. What you should do is rather go for what I shall call a maximin principle, sustainable maximin principle. What does that mean? Sustainable maximin is a sort of compromise, if you wish, between strict equality and then maximizing the sum. It says justice doesn't require you to equalize possibilities between people, potentials between people, at any cost, even if everyone suffers from it. But inequalities can be justified if, all things considered, they improve the possibilities for the worst off, for the people with least possibilities. So you can understand that very simply, I would say, the difference between maximizing the sum or maximizing the minimum or minimizing inequality. I think of a cake to be distributed between people. If the cake is already made, there is no difference between maximizing the minimum and strict equality. If you want to make the smallest piece as big as possible and the cake is made, you have 10 people, well, you cut it in 10 equal pieces. But if the cake is not yet made, then you may say, well, the people who help to make the cake will have 2 pieces instead of 1. And then suddenly you may have lots of volunteers to make the cake. Whereas if you say, whether you help or not, you'll have an equal peace. Then maybe no one will come and help. Huh? And that is just a symbol for the idea that some inequalities in our society may be justifiable because if you didn't have them, what would be there to share among all would be smaller, and therefore even the so-called victims, so that even the victims, so-called victims of inequality, are better off if there is an inequality than if there were strict equality. This goes back, you must be familiar with standard objections to a communist regime, where they say communist regime, at least in the image of some people, is one in which everyone gets the same, and as a result of everyone getting the same, productivity is much lower because there are not sufficient incentives for people to work, for people to save, for people to invest, for people to get better training, etc. Okay? So this is then the second reason why there may be justified deviation from strict equality. That the first reason is that you must make room for responsibility. The second reason is that you must make room for efficiency. And sometimes the two things go together in the sense that perhaps the room would not be clean if one didn't promise 1,000 rubles to someone doing it. So in that case, there is the efficiency consideration and the responsibility consideration go together, but logically speaking, they are distinct. Now, this is a common idea phrased in a simple fashion that is present in Rawls's theory of justice, but it is shared also by many other people who contributed to contemporary theory of justice. Let me now turn to a different question, still present in the quote from Mark Zuckerberg, was also the idea of freedom. So, my second question to you, and we'll proceed in the same way, is social justice now, as I have presented it, is social justice compatible with freedom? So again, think a little bit, and then I'll ask you in the same way. So, okay, so those who think that social justice is compatible with freedom will reply da. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Those who think that there is an unavoidable clash, contradiction between social justice and freedom, so that the answer is no to the question, will say niet. 1, 2, 3. Okay. It's always good when the audience is divided. It means that it is a real question, and it's a question that's worth thinking about. Let me give you again what I believe the best way is to phrase this relationship. Well, first, it's important to make the distinction between formal freedom and real freedom. Formal freedom is the sheer right to do whatever one might wish to do with ourselves, with our body, our mind, and whatever else we have a right to. Whatever external objects we have the right to use, to possess, to destroy, whatever. Okay? This is formal freedom. Then the real freedom is then the real possibility of doing whatever you might wish to do. Real possibility may be a matter of having the appropriate skills, or it may be a matter of having enough purchasing power to buy some things, etc., etc., having some talents in order to do that. Now, we can see, I'm sure you can see then the distinction between the two. For example, you can say, well, we are all free in the formal sense. We are all free to go and spend our holidays in Thailand. Suppose there is no problem in getting the visa, and then we have the right to go and spend our holidays in Thailand. But the people who don't have enough money even to pay the bills here in Russia at the end of each month, these people are free to go to Thailand in the formal sense of having the right to go to Thailand, but they are not really free to go to Thailand because they don't have the money to pay for the tickets to go there. Okay? That's the distinction between the sheer right to do things and then the real freedom to do so. Well, I believe that the best way of articulating equality and freedom within a conception, a coherent, plausible conception of justice, consists in saying that, in fact, social justice is not opposed to freedom, because social justice is about the distribution of real freedom. More precisely, it's a matter of giving the greatest possible freedom to those with least freedom, with least real freedom. So that is back to the idea of a maximin, maximize the minimum of real freedom. It doesn't mean give the same real freedom to all. The real freedom is obviously a matter of degree. It's a matter that depends on your purchasing power, on your talents, etc. But therefore, so it's not that you could tell everyone has the real freedom to do whatever they wish to do. No, you can't do that. But you can distribute the real freedom in a more or less equal way. And in particular, you can try to distribute real freedom in such a way that those with least real freedom are as really free as is sustainable, because sustainability is important. And this is then the conception of justice within the same, roughly the same perspective as Rawls, but with significant differences, which I've tried to defend in Real Freedom for All, in a book called Real Freedom for All, which was published now published in 95, so nearly 25 years ago. I should say, and so that at the same time will take me to the subject of unconditional basic income, but also indicates that within this liberal egalitarian tradition there can be disagreements. I first met John Rawls, so the author of Theory of Justice, in a hotel, at breakfast in a hotel in Paris in 1987. And I thought at the time that his theory of justice provided an obvious justification for an idea to which I had come a few years before, which is this idea of an unconditional basic income given to all. And I mentioned that. He and I were the only two people at the conference we were attending, the only two who got up early in the morning. And so I asked him many questions about his book. I was very young at the time compared to him. And then one of the questions was, well, isn't it obvious that your second principle of justice, one and that fits within this general description, that your second principle of justice justifies a completely unconditional income given to all? And he answered, and that was one of the greatest intellectual disappointments in my life. He said, no, Filipp, this is not true. In fact, you can't expect people who do surfing, who surf all day long on Malibu. Malibu is a beach in California. You can't expect them to be fed at the expense of the community. People who choose not to work by surfing all day long cannot expect to have an income given to them by the society of which they are members. This was a great disappointment to me, and when he and others invited me a few years later to give a lecture at Harvard in 1990, I presented my own defense of an unconditional basic income within this tradition in political philosophy, liberal egalitarian tradition, and it was published under the title, Why Surfers Should Be Fed. Why should the people who surf all day long be fed? And this is why you have a picture of a surfer on the cover of this book, and this book, published a few years later, is a book in which I try to offer this justification in a systematic way. So what is exactly this idea of a universal basic income? And so that comes in to the speech by Mark Zuckerberg. And so, as I suggested just before, it's really this idea of giving the greatest real freedom to those with least of it that, in my view, leads to the justification of a really unconditional basic income at the highest feasible level. This is an idea then to which I spent more time than on which I spent more time than I had expected when the idea first came to me, and then I helped create a network in 1986, which now has sections in many countries in the world advocating that idea. And I returned to that idea in a systematic way last year. So I published a book with a colleague under the title Basic Income, a Radical Proposal for a Free Society and a Sane Economy, published by Harvard University Press just before Mark Zuckerberg pronounced his speech at Harvard. And it's already published also in various other languages, including Italian, Spanish, Korean. I was in Seoul 3 weeks ago for the launch of the book. And there is an edition in Chinese, in complex Chinese characters, published in Taipei, and one in simplified characters to be published in Beijing next month. So it's coming out very soon. So it's this idea that was only defended by a few lunatics 30 years ago or so when it first came to me, now is the object of discussion throughout the world. I'll come back to that. Let me then first define the idea, because it is unavoidably, when you have an idea becoming popular, there is some confusion in the debate. And for example, there was a big debate in connection with the Italian electoral campaign very recently, where there was a confusion, constant confusion, between the idea of basic income, non-conditional basic income, and a sort of guaranteed minimum income that exists already in many countries, and including, but in a pretty low, at a very low level, and in a way that's not very systematic in Russia. What is this? First, a word about the existing schemes. The existing schemes are schemes of social assistance, of aid to the poor. Public assistance, as it's sometimes called, is something that in a way was born at the beginning of the 16th century in a few municipalities in Germany and in Flanders, part of what is now Belgium, where municipalities started saying helping the poor is something for the public authorities to do, not for the church, not for religious organizations, and not only for private charity. Okay? It will be organized in a more efficient way if it's done by the municipalities. It's their responsibility. And that developed in particular in England, the so-called poor laws that became an example, were copied in a number of other countries in Europe and in North America later on, and were then systematized also more recently after the Second World War into real general national guaranteed minimum income systems. But these systems have three features that make them conditional in three senses in which an unconditional basic income, what I call basic income, is not conditional. First of all, whether you give these benefits to a person or how high the level of that benefit is will depend on the family situation of that person. In particular, if a person lives on her own, on his own, you will give more to that person to lift that person out of poverty than if that person lives in a couple or in a broader family with more adults. And that is simply because life costs less if you live with other people, share a home, than if you live alone. One. Second feature, so in other terms, it's not individual. Second feature, it is targeted at the poor. It is what is also sometimes called means tested, so whether you receive the benefit depends on what other income you have. It's given only to people who satisfy the criterion of being poor, sometimes of being extremely poor. Only these people receive it. And thirdly, it is also typically linked to an obligation to be available on the labor market. You don't get it if you say, well, I don't want to work, and therefore I'm poor. So these are the surfers on Malibu, wouldn't receive it. Okay? By contrast, an unconditional basic income, or what Zuckerberg called a universal basic income in his formula, is unconditional in these three senses. So one, it is strictly individual. One doesn't need to come and look at whether you live with someone else. You are entitled to the benefit and at the same level. So if you go and live with someone else, you keep it. Two, it is not means tested. That means that it is given to the rich as well as to the poor. Everyone receives it. Okay? And thirdly, it is obligation-free. That means that it is given to the people who work, it's given to the people who are too old to work, it's given to the people who are too ill to work, it's given to the people who are trying to find a job, but it's also given to the people who decide to stay at home to look after their children, or who decide to study, or who decide to have a break and have no professional activity for a time. It's given to everyone. You give up your job because you can't bear your job, you are entitled to it. Okay? So that's what basic income is. And you can see, I'm going back to some of Zuckerberg's formulations, why it resonates with these formulations, why you can see that someone like Zuckerberg, who is sensitive to what he mentions in that speech, will be attracted to the idea of a basic income. Because one aspect of the basic income is that it's not stigmatizing. In fact, the current social assistance, even in the best conditions, has always some stigmatizing aspect, some humiliating aspect, because you tell people you are only entitled to it if you are poor. And if you are poor, not because you chose to be poor, but because you couldn't do otherwise, because you are really a loser, because you are a pathetic person who can't even provide for your own means. It's only on that condition that we give you an income. And you have to come and keep applying for a job, even if you don't find a job, to show that you are really involuntarily unemployed. unavoidably there is some stigmatizing aspect, some humiliating aspect for the beneficiaries of the existing schemes. In the case of a universal basic income, everyone receives it. There is no reason to be ashamed of receiving it. You don't need to go and apply to some office and try to convince some bureaucrat that you are poor. Also, it's something, says Zuckerberg, that we should be in a society that doesn't stigmatize us, but also that doesn't lock us up. And in fact, one very serious problem with the existing schemes that are targeted at the poor is that they create what is commonly called a poverty trap or an unemployment trap. What does it mean? It means that people receive a benefit. Okay, they receive it month after month. And then there is a job, a part-time job that they could do. But they realize that if they take that job, they will no longer have the benefit. And often, if these people are low-skilled, what the job will pay will be less or hardly more than what they receive in the form of benefit. This is one aspect of what is called the poverty trap, and what people locked up in a situation of exclusion. And another aspect is the fact that when you receive benefit month after month, okay, there is some sort of security, then you could take a job, it may pay you a bit more, but then you don't know whether you'll be able to stick it out because you have children. It will mean getting up early in the morning, preparing your children for school, and then going to do this job. You don't know whether you'll satisfy the boss. You don't know whether you'll be able to keep going with this rhythm. And then you may have to give up the job or may be sacked. And there may be uncertainty about whether you can get the benefit back or how long it will take. And you don't have any reserve. So for that reason, you say, well, it's safer to remain on benefit and to keep this benefit that is reserved for the poor. And so that's an important way in which the existing systems of guaranteed minimum income, which at first time seem obvious, why give it to everyone rather than including people who don't need it, rather than to people who are poor. But of course, as soon as they are above the threshold of poverty, even with a poorly paid job, then you take the benefit away. That's what happens in the existing system, but it's a way of trapping people, or in Zuckerberg's terms, of locking them up. Instead, what basic income does, because of its universality, its total unconditionality, its absolute security it gives, it puts a floor under our feet, everyone's feet, so that everyone gets this income unconditionally that will always be modest, will never be very generous, but it is absolutely secure. You get into a job, you lose the job, you give up the job, you go and live with someone else, you leave someone else, it's always there. And that's quite different from a safety net, as these existing schemes are usually called, which not only have holes, they are net with holes, and many people entitled to these benefits don't get them because they are not informed about where to get it, or they are too ashamed of claiming them. So these safety nets have holes, and you also get stuck in them. You can't really stand on them in order to build your life. Zuckerberg's expression there was that a universal basic income would give everyone a cushion to try new things. And that's an important feature also for the sort of people who attend this event, which is a formulation that's somewhat narrower than Zuckerberg. Sometimes universal basic income is also called venture capital for the people. Venture capital is the capital you are given to try a startup, but venture capital for the people means that everyone gets it. You have this modest floor on which you can bank, and that enables you to try new things. It enables you to do an internship in order to, even if it's badly paid or not paid at all, in order to try to realize what is really your calling, your vocation, what you think you are made for. It also enables you throughout life, and that's another element that is present in Zuckerberg's paragraph, in the same paragraph as he speaks about basic income. He speaks about lifelong learning. Lifelong learning is absolutely crucial, and many people at this meeting are involved with that and trying to think about that, how that could be organized in the internet era. Well, a basic income is something that facilitates lifelong learning throughout from a very early age until long after the Russian pension age, which is very early on international standards. Well, you must be able to do that and to learn thanks to the internet, but also in all sorts of other ways throughout your life. A basic income is something that facilitates throughout life a back and forth between employment, training, education in the broader sense, and all sorts of volunteer activities, in particular within the family, but not only within the family. So that is the idea of basic income, and my own view, which I tried to defend in that book and in the lecture I gave at Harvard a long time ago, is that the most plausible conception of justice in a liberal egalitarian tradition justifies a basic income at the highest feasible, at the highest sustainable level, but with part of it given in kind, that is in the form of good quality free education for everyone, universal, in the form also of good quality universal health care. And so it's sort of basic income in kind, not in cash, and also a number of other public goods, including quality public spaces in our cities, and not only in our cities. And so that is how I connect this idea of universal basic income with my conception of social justice. I'll return in a minute to one aspect of that, but let me then ask an obvious question, which is, how is it to be funded? How is it to be funded, this basic income? Because you may say it's all nice for everyone, not only the poor, to receive an unconditional basic income, but how is it going to be funded? Well, giving a basic income to everyone, including the rich, is not better for the rich, no? Certainly not in an immediate sense better for the rich, but it's better for the poor. No? It's important to understand that. Why is it not better for the rich? Because the rich are going to pay for their own basic income and also part of the basic income of other people. But it's better for the poor because of this absolute security it gives, that whatever you do in your life, you don't need to prove you are poor, etc. You get it in an automatic way, in a secure way. This is what enables you to build your life on top of this basic income, on top of this floor. And to understand then what's key also in my specific justification of an unconditional basic income, it's important to understand that this funding by the richer people in our societies, what looks like funding by the people who are better paid than others through their labor or through their capital, that this is not to be understood as a redistribution of parts of the fruit of the efforts, labor, investment of today's workers and capitalists, but it must be understood as, if not an equal, a more fair sharing of part of the presents, the gifts which we receive from the past incorporated in today's incomes. Let me explain that a bit better. I've been paid a good salary throughout my career. And as a professor emeritus, as it's called, of my university, now I get a pension which is very high, a high percentage of my previous wage. This is, in real terms, maybe 15 times, 10 times, 15, 12 times, something like that, more than what someone doing the same job as me 100 years ago in my country was receiving in terms of real income. Or it is 10 times more, if not more, 15 times more than what someone receives doing the same job as me in sub-Saharan Africa. For example, in the ex-Belgian Congo, where I went and saw the conditions under which my colleagues have to work there. Why is that? Why am I paid so much more than these people? Is it because I work harder? Is it because I'm so much more intelligent than them? Absolutely not. This has simply to do with the fact that in my country, and to a large extent also in your country, there has been a tremendous amount of capital accumulation. There has been a tremendous amount of technological innovation. There has been a tremendous learning in terms of institutions in order to make people function efficiently together, not only in the economic realm. And all this explains most of my income. So when the whole of the product is taxed in one way or another through personal income taxation, through consumption taxation, however you do it, what you do, if you do it in a predictable way, is only to take some of these gifts, parts of these gifts from the past, to distribute them more equally among all. And most of my income is something I don't deserve. It's a gift due to the fact that I was born where I was born and had all the opportunities I was given of education, of finding a job, etc. So one American Nobel laureate called Herbert Simon once wrote, well, if I talk to my fellow Americans and wonder how much of their income is due to their efforts rather than to the social capital that is present in the context in which they were able to work, then if I say that the 10% is due to their efforts, I'm being generous to them. All the rest is due to the contingent fact, the lucky fact for them that they were born and could be educated and could work in the context in which they work. And so the fundamental justification for basic income is related to that. It says, well, we have this gift from the past, and people like Zuckerberg become very rich, but they become so as rich as they are because of happy circumstances created by people different from themselves. How much would Zuckerberg earn if electricity had not been invented, if computers had not been invented, if the internet had not been invented? All this by people who are not Zuckerberg himself, nor anyone he knows personally. And it's not only these inventors that made a difference, it's also the mother of the person who invented electricity, who was very kind, smiled to the little child and who was going to become a genius, and thanks to this smile made him a genius rather than a psychopath, right? So you have all these people who contributed to the current level of productivity in all sorts of ways, the school teachers, whatever, in all sorts of ways. And we benefit from all these things that have happened without our doing anything for it. And it is this rent, as the economists call it, and this gift from the past, which a basic income consists in distributing in a more fair way. What happens today, what is happening today increasingly, because of globalization, because of the labor-saving technical change, so automation, robotization, artificial intelligence, to which some participants in this conference hope to contribute. All these things that have happened, that are expected to happen, joined with globalization, also joined with other factors in a number of countries, like the weakening of the labor unions. All this is leading to a very sharp polarization of earning power, of earnings, so that you have a minority of people, but a pretty big minority of people who own very valuable skills, which they can sell throughout the planet, directly or indirectly, or who own intellectual property rights, or who own capital. And these people have seen their earning potential, what they can earn, has been massively increasing. Zuckerberg being, of course, a sort of massive example of that. But at the same time, there are many people throughout the world, including in this country, whose situation has become more precarious, whose level of income and potential income has fallen below the level of poverty, or if it's still above the level of poverty, they are constantly at risk of falling under the threshold of poverty because of international competition, because of technical innovations on which they have no grip. So the result of that is that that earning power, the capacity to earn money, in particular the secure capacity to do that, has become distributed in an increasingly polarized way, an increasingly unequal way. And so what needs to be done is including through international collaboration, getting the money which including which the money which the very rich Russian oligarchs, as they are called, and who live in London or elsewhere in the world, so getting a better grip on the income that is generated in any particular country through international, more efficient, more effective international collaboration is an important component of what is needed in order to make generous basic income sustainable. And this is in a way recognized by Zuckerberg in his speech, when he says people like me who should pay for it, who should pay for this freedom, real freedom that would be given to all, real freedom to access to a meaningful role in society, and to provide this cushion that would enable everyone, not just the privileged, to try new things, in his words. And he, turning to his Harvard graduates, he says, many of you will need to contribute to that too. And doing that is really not taxing the efforts that are being made by Zuckerberg, his ingenuity. Even if you tax him at if you tax away 90% of his income, he'll still receive a huge reward for what he was doing. Bill Gates, the owner of, founder of Microsoft, was once asked, did you need to have the prospect of all this huge wealth you now have in order to create Microsoft and develop it? Of course not, he said. And so it's not, I mean, all this wealth is not needed as an economic incentive, would not be justified as a justified inequality for the second reason I mentioned before, for a reason of efficiency. But he said, nevertheless, he preferred not to be taxed on this huge income because he believes he can make a better use of his wealth than the taxing authorities, than the states, the governments would do. But the point is that it is not unfair to tax massively this wealth and this income, which is more and more concentrated in a smaller proportion of the population. Let me now ask you a final question before going into some more sort of factual information about the current state of debate about this idea in the world. I'm going to ask you, who among you thinks that basic income already exists somewhere in the world, and who thinks that it doesn't exist anywhere in the world? Okay, let me proceed in the same way. And so first, those who think it exists will say da, and then the others will say niet. So who among you, so do you believe, those among you who believe that there is a basic income in some place in the world will say da, Odin, dva, tri. Who think it doesn't exist anywhere in the world will say niet, Odin, dva, tri. Okay, well, here must, well, what is the right answer? Okay, it does exist in the world, but in an anecdotal, nearly anecdotal fashion. I should say that it does exist in the world in a restricted way, that is, in a way that's restricted to the children, in the sense that there is a universal child benefit exists in quite a large number of countries, where irrespective of the situation of the parents, poor or rich, whether they contributed to social insurance system or not, every child receives it. That exists in a number of countries. There are a few countries, some rich, some poor, where there is a basic income for the older people, mainly for quite some time in Denmark, in the Netherlands, so in Holland, and also more recently in Bolivia. More fragile way, you have a real basic income for the old people, so that irrespective of whether you live alone or not, irrespective of whether you have income from another source or not, and irrespective of your past career, you are entitled to a basic pension. That happens. But for the bulk of the adult population, there are only 2 places in the world where a basic income exists, but at a very low level compared to the GDP per capita, to average income in those places. One of these is Alaska, not very far from here, relatively speaking, and the other one is Macau, also not that far from here, closer to here than to my country. What explains that? Well, in the case of Alaska, it's part of the revenues from the extraction of oil in the north of Alaska that was put into a fund, the Alaska Permanent Fund, and that pays every year, pays a dividend to every Alaska resident. The amount is oscillating because this fund is invested worldwide, and so the yield of the interest on this fund has been varying from year to year, and in recent years, on average, it has been $2,000 per year. $2,000 per year. That's about 2 or 3%, depending on the year, of GDP per capita in Alaska. In the case of Macau, it's more fragile and it's more recent, and there it's part of the revenues from the casinos, gambling, which is massive in Macau, not mainly by gambling by Macau citizens, it's mainly people from mainland China who come to Macau, which is an autonomous part of the Republic of China, and these casinos make huge profits, sort of exploiting the irrationality of the Chinese gamblers, and part of these profits are given in the form of an annual dividend to all the residents, the permanent residents of Macau. But it's decided on year to year and may not last for very long. So the people who replied "da" were right, but in a minimal way, because this is not something that could replace a guaranteed minimum income. But there is currently a lot of serious discussion about it in many places, but it only happened very recently. For example, there was a national referendum in Switzerland about it that failed, but it was also a referendum where the initiators were asking for basic income, a very high basic income at the level of 2,500 Swiss francs, which is more or less $2,500 per month, so it's far above the level in Alaska. There was 1/4 of the population voted in favor of it, but had it passed, it would have been part of the Swiss constitution, so it would have had a lot of power. But it certainly created a lot of discussion about it in Switzerland, about the pros and cons and contrasts of proposals such as that one. There was a discussion in France at the last presidential election that led to the election of President Macron, because one of his opponents, the candidate of the Socialist Party, had proposed that as his central proposal, what he called a universal income. He won the primary for the Socialist Party, but lost against Macron in the presidential election itself. There is now going on in Finland, there is an experiment that started at the beginning of last year and is continuing until the end of this year. And there was some news propagated saying that the Finnish government was interrupting the experiment, suggesting that it was because the results were not what was expected. No, the experiment had been planned for 2 years and will continue until the end of the second year. There was never a commitment on the part of the government to do more, and the first results will only be known after all the data are being analyzed and the experimental group compared to the control group, etc. The first results will only be known in the middle of next year, of 2019. To take also some countries that are poorer per capita than Russia, you have in Mexico one of the presidential candidates at last week's election was defending, he has a video where he explains that unconditional basic income would be perfectly feasible in Mexico, and he came second in the vote a week ago. And then still sort of very heavily discussed in, if I take the Italian case, Italy saw the creation of a new party out of nothing called the Five Star Movement, Cinque Stelle, that was created by a stand-up comedian, Beppe Grillo. And Beppe Grillo got enamored, became in love with this idea of a universal basic income. And you can see on some videos how he defends the idea against the stigmatization of social assistance. And it was defended under the name of a citizenship income, which is the word which is an expression commonly used to refer to basic income in some countries, for example, in the Scandinavian countries. But the actual proposal in the end made in the campaign by his movement was in fact a form of social assistance. It remains sort of guaranteed minimum income that is means tested, that is, it's restricted to the poor, and there is a work condition. You must be available for work in order to get it, and the poverty is defined at the level of the family. So we really have a traditional social assistance scheme, but at a very generous and, in my view, unsustainable level. So what I propose and what is now in in the government program is 780 euros per month, but in a conditional way, so creating a very deep poverty trap, because for many people it will be simply impossible to find a part-time job that pays as much as this in Italy, especially in southern Italy. But again, like in Switzerland, like in France, this fed a very active debate about basic income in the country, but also outside of the country. In the Italian case, in part because there was a confusion about what was actually proposed. Now, finally, and to close, is this sort of proposal relevant in places like Russia, which don't have a systematic, from what I understand, but the information I managed to gather, but some of you may be able to give me more precise information about that. And so in countries in which there is fairly generous and systematic national guaranteed minimum income system of a conditional sort, people have experienced, discovered the difficulties and the problems, the perverse effects of these schemes, and therefore the field is prepared for more radical proposals. Also the funding of it, as you move from one system to another, will be easier than if you start from far less, and which might be the case in the case of Russia, but is also the case in some poorer countries in which the idea is being discussed, where, like Mexico, like Brazil, which I didn't mention. But even if you first have to introduce something like a conditional scheme, I really believe in the importance of having this longer-term vision with a real unconditional basic income. Because social assistance will always be and be seen as sort of marginal repair work, where you have a market economy that functions and then a number of people who fall out of the boat, and then you have to give them some income to prevent them from starving, and then you realize that some of the people working are still starving, you need to give a bit more, etc. All this will always be patchwork, will always be sort of marginal repair work. It's not part of a sort of society to which we can aspire. And I strongly believe in the importance of having a utopia, a vision of the future that's not just a dream, but that is a coherent picture of a better society, of a more just society, with justice being filled in the way I mentioned before. That is a conception of justice that makes room for freedom, that makes room for equality, that makes room for efficiency, and so vision of a just society in this sense, and with a set of institutions that are part of it. Lifelong learning in a far more flexible way than what we have now, far more general way, but also with a basic income, and that would not replace the whole of social assistance, would not replace the whole of social insurance, wouldn't replace obviously the education system or the healthcare system, but would provide a floor for everyone to stand up, or a cushion to try new things, as Zuckerberg put it. And one of the authors I like to quote in order to strengthen this view about the importance of a utopia is Friedrich Hayek. Friedrich Hayek is originally an Austrian economist, a Nobel Prize in economics, and also regarded as the founding father of so-called neoliberalism. In 1949, he published an article under the title The Intellectuals and Socialism. And essentially what he said there is this. He said, why is it that socialism is winning all over the world? Just after the Second World War, he said there is nationalization of industry, mining in various countries, West European countries. There is the development of the welfare state. There is the New Deal in the United States. There is the conversion of Eastern Europe to the Soviet model or to another socialist model like in Yugoslavia. So socialism, or statism as he called it, is winning all over the world. Why is that, he said? It is because socialists were bold enough to elaborate and propose a utopia. It is having this utopia that gave them the strength to realize what they did realize, what they are realizing now in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. And he continues, this is why we liberals, he said, liberals in the sense of classical liberals, radical pro-market people, this is why we liberals need to build and defend a liberal utopia. This is what will make one day possible what today is regarded as politically impossible. If you just confine yourself to what is now politically possible, you'll never change what is politically possible. You'll never change the frontiers and the boundaries of political possibilities. And I really believe that is correct. And in fact, neoliberalism would not have dominated gradually some part of the intelligentsia and then public policy throughout the world had it not been for utopian thinkers like Hayek after the Second World War, or even he had started before the war. And I think that's what we need today, not to defend the neoliberal utopia, but we absolutely need an alternative to that neoliberal utopia of total submission to the market, just as we need an alternative to the old socialist utopia of total submission to the state. And this utopia, I believe, needs a number of elements. One of them, a central one, is this idea of universal basic income, of a floor on which we can stand, on a cushion to try new things, to use again Zuckerberg's expression. But we need other things too, like a clever way of organizing lifelong learning, as I mentioned before, and as is central also in this event, and other things like reconquering our cities against cars to give a central role to enjoyable mobility, immobility, not only to sustainable mobility. We need again to have public spaces as places where we can meet, where we can let our kids walk around, and where all sorts of things can be organized to bring together our increasingly diverse populations. So if I have one message, one final message illustrated by my talk, is be utopian. Be there to be bold enough to be utopian, but not just dreamers, interdisciplinary utopians. And so where engineers, technologists, sociologists, economists, lawyers, philosophers think together about a better world, and this better world must be, conceiving it must be fed by a cool, cold-blooded analysis of the facts, but also by values, and our values, the central aspect of these values, the central aspect of the values must be a certain conception of what a just society, of what would be, of what social justice is. Hence, the centrality of, and when we think about contemporary capitalism, with which we are stuck with capitalism, mankind may die from capitalism, but it will die with capitalism. So I don't think there is a way of escaping it, but there's a massive way of making it more just than it is, but it needs a lot of strong transnational action, and gathering like this, people like you must be part of that process, of that effort. Thank you for your attention. I think there is time for questions, and I welcome all reactions. I came here to learn more. Yes. So how are there, if you push, so how should we proceed? If you push on the button?
This one, it does work. Well, thank you for such an interesting lecture. The topic is pretty discussive. So in fact, I have a lot of questions, but I'll stick to one or two if you allow. So the first one is, I heard about this experiment in Finland, and could you share a little bit more information on how is it going there, and primarily what outcomes they want to get, and how will they measure the outcomes, and what's the current state of it?
You said you had a couple of questions? Oh, no, that is the question. Okay, let me reply to it immediately. What they did in Finland is the following. So they have in Finland a general guaranteed minimum income system targeted at the poor, of the sort I mentioned before, at the level of 570 euros per month and per person. Now, there were, at the start of the experiment, about 150,000 people in Finland receiving this income, people who were unemployed and who were receiving this income if they were living on their own, if they didn't have any other job, and providing they were available on the labor market. What did the experiment consist in? They chose randomly 2,000 people out of these 150,000, and I told them, for the next 2 years, you will keep receiving the 570, but in a strictly individual way. So if you go and live with someone else, you keep it. It's universal in the sense that you can combine it with income from work without limit. And we shall no longer bother you, so by asking you to apply for jobs and so on. Okay, that's the nature of the experiment. And so what they want then to record after 2 years is what will these people have done during the 2 years? Will they have taken part-time jobs, full-time jobs, nothing at all, gone into training, looked after their children, whatever, compared to the rest of the 150,000. So it will take a while to get the results, but these are the results they are going to get. What can we learn from that? We can't learn from that whether a basic income unconditional at 570 euros per month in Finland is sustainable or unsustainable. We cannot learn it because for several reasons, but one of them, the most fundamental, the most intrinsic, is that there is no worker in the experiment. So it was restricted to people who were unemployed initially. Of course, part of the point of a basic income is to give more freedom to the workers, people who are now working, especially on low wages, will have the possibility of reducing their working time or stopping work for a while in order to get further training without the loss of a benefit. They would get a benefit if they do that. And of course, the expectation is that it will have a negative impact on the labor supply, on how many people work or how many hours they work, among the people who are currently working, at least among the low paid. But none of this can be learned from the experiment because they were not, these people were not represented in the experiment, and that to the regret of the people doing the experiment. Another limit is that these 2,000 people are spread all over Finland. Now, one of the hoped for effects, one of the expected effects, and one of the arguments for basic income is that as a result of this basic income, you will have an impact on the sort of jobs that will turn out to be viable. In particular, thanks to the basic income, you should have more startups, more people going self-employed because of the security provided by it. On the other hand, the sort of shitty jobs, the lousy jobs, the bad jobs will not completely disappear. But if they are to become viable, they'll have to be paid more, or they'll have to be improved, if only in terms of the timetables, the schedules, the way in which the boss treats the personnel and all that. But these effects are completely imperceptible in an experiment where you just have 2,000 people in a labor market of 5 million. So you will not be able to do that. So that my general attitude, and I've been interviewed many times about that, is, and we discussed that in the book which I showed, in the basic income book, is that I'm very skeptical about the usefulness of such experiments in terms of the knowledge they give us about the sustainability or not of a basic income of a certain type, at a certain level, funded in a certain way. But at the same time, they are fantastic tools of propaganda, because whether you are for or against basic income, many people, everyone has heard about it in Finland, and many people, including here, have heard about it elsewhere. And that means, well, you say, even if a Finnish government, even if a right-of-center government thinks that the idea is relevant enough to organize an experiment about it, maybe there is something to it. What are the advantages? What are the disadvantages? And for this reason, I welcome these experiments. And there are many more at the moment that are being planned in California, in Michigan, in Scotland, in Aquitaine, in the south of France, in Barcelona. And so everywhere they want, in Holland, in several cities in Holland, everywhere people want to have their own experiment. Again, I'm skeptical, and the more limited the experiment, the more skeptical I am. But in terms of making people aware of the idea, it's fantastic. Was another question there? Yeah. Yes?
Thank you for your lection. I have a question. Most of countries now are trying to increase GDP, but... I'm sorry?
Many countries are?
Many countries are increasing GDP. But it's clear that it is not an endless process because Earth resources are finite. What do you think? Should we take another goal except of increasing GDP? Thank you.
Yes. Well, I was in Korea, I think it was 3 weeks ago, about that, for a big event that coincided with the publication of the Korean edition of our book on basic income. I was there for a public lecture, but also a panel discussion with Joe Stiglitz and Angus Deaton, two recent Nobel laureates in economics. And part of the discussion should soon be on YouTube, was on basic income. But the title of the whole event, which at the beginning I didn't quite understand, was Beyond $30,000. And then I asked the Koreans to explain that to me. And they said, well, Korea, which was among the poorest countries in the world in the 1960s, and South Korea, is now nearly at the level of $30,000 per capita annually. And so they are nearly at that point. But the whole conference was organized under the title Beyond $30,000, meaning beyond thinking only about growth. And one of the things I learned there, and to my great surprise, is that, in fact, from the 1st of July this year, with the new president, they had decided to reduce the maximum working time week and the maximum working week from 68 hours to 52 hours. So Koreans work really a lot. I mean, the maximum working week in my country is 38 hours per week. And so the underlying idea, and there were other contributions on that time on that topic of working time reduction, was shouldn't we Koreans care a bit more about other things than maximizing the GDP and by taking more time off to do other things. And you find the same idea in the quote from Zuckerberg, which I mentioned, where he said, if I return to that, so to his quote, where at the beginning he said we should have a society that measures progress and not just by economic metrics like GDP, but by how many of us have a role we find meaningful. And that is closely related to my idea of maximin real freedom, because instead of trying to maximize the total output, we should organize our society in such a way that those with least choice, with least possibility of finding a role which they find meaningful, have as much choice, as much real freedom as possible. So I'm all in agreement with Zuckerberg in that quote, and I'm all in agreement with the spirit behind this meeting in South Korea, which doesn't mean that we should be contemptuous about growth. There are lots of very poor countries in the world which need a lot of growth, of course a lot of intelligent growth, because the overall level of poverty in these countries is enormous. There are a few oligarchs there too that appropriate a lot of money, but even if you redistributed all the money of the oligarchs in these countries, the countries would still be, the average citizen would still be very, very poor. And so you need growth, and especially in Africa, and so there remains a growth agenda. But I strongly believe that we should go for our ultimate aim in this respect, and shouldn't be constant growth, so even sustainable growth. It should be to try to find a standard of living and a way of living all over the planet that is sustainably generalizable. Sustainably generalizable. That means that our way of moving about, of building, of eating, of consuming more generally, of producing, that all our ways of functioning should be altered, should be refashioned in such a way that they can be generalized for the whole planet, not just for some of the privileged parts of the planet, so all the way to the poorest country in Africa. It must be generalized, and generalized in a sustainable way. It shouldn't be the privilege of a single generation, and then you blow up the planet. And that's why we need a constant search for innovation, for technology, for new technology, but intelligent technology that takes these limits into account. So we should go beyond growth, have as an objective, and so have other objectives than growth, without sort of neglecting the fact that growth, intelligent growth, is still needed, especially in some parts of the planet, of today's Earth. More questions? Yes, back there. Yeah.
Thank you so much for a keynote. I'm actually. Yeah.
Louder.
Can you hear me? Yeah, that's better. I'm actually super pro basic universal income, and it even is assumed by me that at a certain level of consciousness and a certain level of values, it's perhaps something very obvious one should implement. But then the question is, as long as we're talking about the universal basic income as a political reform or an economical reform, therefore kind of a top-down initiative which should be implemented by the government, and it seems to be that most of the governments are obviously not super interested in implementing this strategy. Do you see any ways we can organize bottom-up initiatives, some civic initiatives, civic movements or whatever, that can push the movement of basic universal income up and not, you know, make us wait until the governments will finally do something about that?
Well, I think that a basic income needs to be introduced at a level that at least the level of a country in order to be sustainable. And that means that the government, the democratic government of that country, must be involved and convinced at some point that this is the way to go. Now, there are, of course, all sorts of bottom-up initiatives that can help in the process, including the people who in some municipalities are making experiments. Also, it's simply, and these experiments are ways of trying to give the governments the confidence to go forward. But at some point you need a decision by the finance ministry of a country to reform the personal income tax system and to reform also in part the social benefit system in such a way that a basic income is being introduced. But the pressure that comes bottom up will be important. So we can take as I think a useful analogy what happened with the first introduction of a social insurance system. And because I talked earlier about social assistance, which is public assistance, public aid to the poor, that was born at the beginning of the 16th century. But then you had another very important development with the appearance of a totally different model of social protection for the first time at the end of the 19th century, and that was social insurance, first in Bismarck's Germany. It was top-down, so the first system of state pensions in the world, first system of sickness insurance, and then a bit later the first system of involuntary unemployment, restricted initially to industrial workers, not to agricultural workers. Okay. Why was that introduced? It had to be introduced top-down, but under pressure from the bottom, because there was something called the Social Democratic Party at the time with a strong Marxist inspiration that was getting more and more support from an increasing part of the working class, and Bismarck felt forced to introduce that system out of fear that there would be a revolution in his country. At the same time, it was also a clever way of trying to unite Germany more strongly, because until then, Germany was a set of independent states, and it's only under Bismarck that it became one single Reich, one single nation, and having this state-organized pension system in particular played an important role. But you can see there why it had to be top-down, otherwise it wouldn't exist, it wouldn't be sustainable. But grassroots movements, in that case the labor movement, made a lot of difference. And so I believe that bottom-up pressure can play a role both by local experiments used as ways of propagating that idea, but also by having movements that press then political parties to introduce that idea in their program through the normal democratic electoral process.
I'm afraid it's going to be a long way for us then. I'm afraid with this model it's going to be a long way for us then. I didn't hear that. It doesn't. Yeah, I'm saying that I'm afraid that even though I agree with you, but with this model, it's going to be a really, really long way for us, since that acknowledgement of a need for this kind of experiment is not yet there and not even coming. So maybe if we would search for some changed or altered experiments in the same direction that can be more immediate and more on the local level, maybe that could push the line, but I have no idea what that could be at the moment.
Yeah, so if I understood your question properly, sometimes people are proposing to start a real basic income with local money, with a local currency. So where you would distribute local currency that can only be spent on local products. But of course you need some sort of convertibility of the local money into the legal tender, the official currency. But the fundamental difficulty, of course, with any small-scale experiment is sort of a permanent emigration and immigration. If you do that in a neighborhood, in a village, and then who pays for it? And there must be some redistribution, but then you won't do it with funds coming from elsewhere, so they must be generated locally. And so there will always be then the possibility for people who are net contributors to say, oh, I'm going to move into the suburbs. If the city of Vladivostok starts it, then with a generous scheme for the local population, I'm going to live in a suburb where the scheme doesn't exist, and then I won't be taxed for the benefits distributed to the people of Vladivostok. And conversely, for people who live out of Vladivostok, they say, oh, now there is a generous basic income scheme in Vladivostok. Even if I'm an artist and I do other activities, this is the place to be. And so the long-term sustainability will be threatened by this sort of selective immigration and selective emigration. So to make it sustainable, you need a top-down aspect, but to get it on the way, you can have lots of local initiatives, both in the form of lobbying and in the form of experimenting. There was, yeah.
Thank you for a speech. And do you know about China social rating experiment?
About what? What?
Social rating experiment. Do you know about it? And can we connect the social rating and basic income?
Social? I didn't get the word. But what experiments?
Social ranking, and every person in China has credit rating, and this rating could maybe restricted some opinion, some freedom, or some people can't maybe book tickets and so on. The IT system take big data about person and make this ranking and ratings.
The answer is no, I don't know about it. So if you can tell me more about it, perhaps after the session, I'd be grateful, but I don't know about it.
Okay,
yeah.
Thank you.
Спасибо большое за ваш рассказ, супер интересная тема. И мой вопрос вот какой. А готовы ли сами люди к тому, чтобы безусловный базовый доход был введен? Смогут ли люди, причем не только бедные, а люди во всей своей массе и те, кто сейчас неплохо зарабатывает, сдвинуть свою парадигму и перейти от соревновательности вокруг статусных покупок, таких как дорогие машины, большие дома, драгоценности и все в таком духе? Смогут ли они перейти от парадигмы соревновательности вот за это, за все, к действительно в массовом масштабе к реализации своего настоящего жизненного потенциала?
Well, you don't need a sudden big revolution, and a basic income is perfectly compatible with some people having as their sole ideal in life to have a big car bigger than the car of their neighbor. But these people will be taxed on their income. Maybe the car, the car of their dreams will be unaffordable if they are taxed as much as they would need to be in order to fund everyone's basic income. And that is what Zuckerberg said, people like you will have to pay for it, or people like me, Mark Zuckerberg will have to pay for it, and that means certain things which we could otherwise buy, a whole island for the very rich, we shall not be able to buy. But if people still have that ambition, that is perfectly compatible. So basic income doesn't require people to have a modest life. Indeed, the basic income can be in a sustainable way more generous if lots of people still want to have a high income on which they will be taxed to enable everyone to make the choices that correspond to their particular vocation. So we don't, it's not as if we needed a change of mentality along this dimension before a basic income can be implemented, and certainly we don't need a change of that sort to make it sustainable, because a basic income will still need people who are keen enough about having more money to spend a lot of their life earning that money on which they will be taxed for everyone's benefit. Yes?
Спасибо за ответ. Я понимаю, что сдвиг парадигмы не обязателен, но как вы думаете, произойдет ли он в массовом масштабе или нет? И если произойдет, то что может заменить, вот сейчас все соревнуются по показателю денег, ну многие, по крайней мере, и если такой сдвиг произойдет, что может его заменить? Успехи в искусстве или что?
Yes, I think the change of mind, there is a change of mind that is needed in order to make it politically feasible. And because what is required is on the part of sufficient people, a sufficient number of people in society, what is required is that they feel it is fair to give this income as an unconditional floor for everyone to have the possibility to try new things, again to quote Zuckerberg. And that requires some sort of gestalt switch, as some psychologists call it, a difference in perception. And you shouldn't, if you give this possibility to artists, to people who want to do a startup, etc., giving them this possibility, and some who will fail, some who will succeed, is not giving them this possibility through taxation on my money is not something that is unfair to me, because, and that's what I said earlier, and the switch we need is really to see that what is done in this way is simply sharing in a more fair way gifts that we received from the past and for which we personally didn't do anything. So that is a switch which we need. But we don't need a shift away, or a complete shift away from an ethics of competition in particular, because technological innovation in particular will be helped in some cases by cooperation between people, and but in some cases also by competition. And the first innovator and the person who is the first to invent social medium like Facebook, he will have an advantage and will be able to cash in a considerable number of billions before anyone else comes in. So that sort of competition will keep sort of our technological progress moving, and we need to find in that area, like in other areas, the right balance between competition and cooperation. But a radical shift away from competition is not required for a basic income to make sense and to be sustainable. Yes, more questions? Yes?
If nobody minds, all right. Do you admit a possibility that most of the people just don't want to do nothing? And
don't want to
do anything at all? And do you admit well, I have a theory. Well, it's not mine, maybe it was borrowed somewhere, but that money and earning money for living, making money for living, is a kind of, you know, evolutional mechanism for human beings. And if you switch it off, we might follow the path of, did you see the movie Idiocracy? No? Well, if I might, it's my personal advice to you to watch this movie. So, I mean, so this mechanism will be switched off, and so the humanity will degrade, because, well, people who really don't want to do nothing but sit in front of their TVs, not even surf in the ocean, but sit in front of their TVs, will have the same rights for survival. Well, this is, you know, this is a bit weird to say things like this, I imagine, but anyway, you know what I mean? And the population will grow, and so the evolution, I mean, the progress will stop of humanity.
Yeah. Well, let me respond two things to that. The first one is that when you conduct interview, and that has been done in various countries, people are asked, do you think that if there is a basic income, so obligation-free, that other people, many other people will stop working? And many people, a majority of people say yes. And then in the same interview, they ask the people, and will you stop working? They say, of course not. And so they try again and again, and they don't find these people about whom other people say they'll stop working. Because everyone say, I'll keep working, but the others won't. But where are the others? They can't be found. And so it's always a suspicion that others will take advantage, whereas you won't. And so we have added this common perception, perhaps as a result of some news having focused on really lazy people somewhere, and that sort of produces this general perception or misperception. The other thing, what you said about the evolutionary mechanism, well, in our book on basic income, we make at some point a brief analogy, which is linked to what you are saying. In fact, in this country, like elsewhere, our sexual morals has changed dramatically over the last decennia. So until not so long ago, including in my youth, there was a very strong moral condemnation of homosexuality, of premarital sex, of extramarital sex. And that has largely disappeared today in Western Europe, certainly. And you could say, well, that's related to one important factor, which is the dramatic fall in the rate of infant mortality. Because there used to be a time where it was important for sexual gratification to be linked to reproduction. And therefore, sexuality was a sort of reward for being married, and therefore disposed to form a family and procreate. But as we got to a situation in which infant mortality declined, and so you could keep the population going with a far smaller number of kids, so sexual morality sort of became far looser. And so the analogy we make is, isn't this happening now also in the case of the work ethics? Because there used to be a time when we were dependent on physical agricultural work, while the women were in part working in the fields, but also a large part of the time looking after their many children. Men, we relied on every man in the country, or nearly every man in the country, apart from a few noblemen, to work and to work full time. But gradually, with technological improvement, now maybe it's enough to have 4 or 5% of the population working in order to have our basic needs covered, because of the green revolution in the fields or technical advances of all sorts. And anyway, we still need to keep our standard of living, not the bare livelihood. We need enough people who are willing to work. But these are people, the people who we need are people with good level of intelligence, good talents, good skills, etc. And we really don't need everyone to work in our society full time in order to keep our good standard of living. And so, therefore, what might be happening is that our moral intuitions as regards work are a bit outdated, just as the moral intuitions with which I was brought up as a child were outdated and gradually disappeared in the course of my life in the society in which I lived. And so I think there is, in a sense, something evolutionary about our ethical intuitions about the importance we get to work, but it's worth thinking about the gradual disappearance of that. But I'm saying that, but at the same time, I strongly maintain, and that sometimes people say, well, this is contradictory with your defense of a basic income, but it's not. And I strongly believe in the importance of a moral duty to work, but to work in a sense that's different from the usual one. The usual sense of work is employment. No, there is a different sense of work, which is to make efforts in order to do something that's useful for other people than yourself. I believe that there is no good society, that there is no good life without a moral duty of this sort. And as an anecdote, there is in the Christian tradition, no doubt Russia is also in that Christian tradition, there is a famous sentence in one of the letters of St. Paul to the Thessalonians. And this famous sentence says, if you don't work, you will not eat. Okay? And this is often used in the current debate about basic income and to condemn basic income from this Christian tradition. But if you read this passage in St. Paul, what he says in that passage, he says, well, you know, St. Paul and his friends are visiting Christians in various cities in the Middle East, they are in Greece, Thessaloniki, and he says when we go there, we go and eat with the people there, and it's not, he says, it's not that we don't have the right to eat without working, but I instruct you to follow our example, which is to help and to work as much as we can and to help the people there, whoever we are visiting. And so there you can see that there is a difference between having the right to be fed without work and the duty to participate in society in a way that is useful. And this, of course, remains very important. You won't be respected by your friends, by your family, by your peer groups, by society in general. You won't be admired, you won't be esteemed if you just cash in your basic income and then enjoy yourself. You will only get this esteem, the positive social sanctions will only accrue to you if you try to be a good citizen, a good neighbor, a good member of a family. And this remains, and it's by no way abolished by the introduction of a basic income. On the contrary, because you give more people a possibility, again to use Zuckerberg's phrase, and to find a role that is meaningful to you, and you give more people this possibility, and being meaningful to you means, in most cases, being useful to others, meaningful to you because you feel you are doing something really useful. So basic income gives more possibilities of doing that to people who have very few possibilities of that sort. You, most of the people who attend this conference, have lots of possibilities of being useful to others, but some have very few and sometimes very degrading possibilities, doing jobs that are really meaningless, and I can't see the meaning in that, in those jobs. Bullshit jobs, as a British Academy anthropologists call that, in a sort of rather sensationalist way. So you give them more possibilities. So this moral duty to be useful to others than yourself is only increased by the introduction of a basic income. And that, I think, goes some way to catch the intuition that is behind your question, and which I shared, which is that it's not that we should say work, and we are not in a society beyond work. No, we are a society in which we must make sure that everyone who wants to have paid employment gets paid employment, and a basic income is part of that, because it diminishes this poverty trap, which is created by the conditional guaranteed minimum income system or by the unemployment system, benefit system. So it's helping people to have the real possibility of access to a job, but at the same time it gives them the strength, the power to refuse jobs that are meaningless. That's what a basic income does.
Thank you. We'll see.
More questions? Okay, thank you to you. And I would like to have more details about the Chinese experiment there. And, yeah.